and Bob, to hear from you. Obviously, your extensive executive experience, ACL, and so much more. We'd really like to just continue on. Where are we going with SMRs? Continuity and change, it seems to me, is upon us.
Yeah, so Morgan set this up nicely. So I'm going to be talking about where we are and where the future is going. While I'm going to have a certain Canadian perspective, I have to say many of my remarks are intended to provide more of a global perspective. This is a global challenge we have here, and Canada has an opportunity to play into that big time. SMRs are going to play into my discussion. It's somewhat of a larger discussion as well. So let me just say right up front, here's my bottom line. And the 7 points I make here is what I'm going to talk. I've got a slide or two in each of those, get through this in 20 minutes. So to Morgan's point, Canada has legitimacy in the nuclear energy space. We know this, and we don't have the baggage of having nuclear weapons. The climate emergency is big, it's scary. We need lots of nuclear energy. We also need lots of variable renewables. We've got to get out of the habit of trying to eat each other's lunch in this space. Nuclear actually complements and enables variable renewables, wind and solar. We're on the cusp of yet another major innovation in nuclear technology. I'll talk about that. SMRs are part of it. It's more. We brand it nuclear. SMRs come into this. Yes, we talk about cost of production and speed of production, but that's not the real value proposition around SMRs. I'll explain that. It's this idea of being a multi-tool in the energy system of the world, but it's not the old business model. SMRs require some fundamental rethink, particularly in economics and in what I call systems thinking. And then one comes back to the big, scary change. What I'm used to talking to people about now, if you look at growing the footprint of nuclear globally so that it's upwards of 20% of the global energy system, we need about 10,000 or more new nuclear reactors in the next 30 years. 10,000, a scary number. And just to be controversial, a comment that some of you may have heard I made last week, we have a hesitant public when it comes to nuclear, and I'm going to be controversial. We don't have a waste problem. We have a trust problem. So let's get into this. One slide to do what Morgan has done. We are a Tier 1 nuclear nation. Rob, thanks to Saskatchewan, you're providing the world and Canada with the richest uranium in the world. Thank you. My kids say thank you. My grandkids say thank you. We have our big operating nuclear generating stations. Bruce is the largest in the world. We have our homegrown technology. The Canadian Nuclear Laboratories are the largest science and technology complex in Canada, and we have a science-based regulator that knows its business. So we know what we're talking about here. When we come back to this climate emergency and my comment about we have a big change ahead of us, when we look at the climate emergency, two comments. The evidence is stark. The challenge is unprecedented. Our world is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, energy systems, the economy. 83% of today's energy comes from fossil fuels, 4% nuclear. I'm talking about energy, not just electricity. Electricity is about 30% of the global energy system. And we're continuing to grow demand. As populations grow, as demand for economic growth pulls demand. And our climate scientists are pretty unanimous. If we don't get off our GHG emissions, the world is going to be a pretty scary place. I am enormously concerned for my 9 grandchildren and their children. And there is no one solution. There is no silver bullet. We need it all. There are, in fact, multiple transitions required here. There's about a transition to decarbonize energy production, and in particular electricity production, and then grow it, the clean electricity path. There's a need to decarbonize end use, transportation, heating, industry uses, and there's a need to pull back on demand through conservation. And importantly, while getting off GHG emissions is the goal here, there's other things that have to be accomplished at the same time. Geopolitical, socioeconomic, externalities such as waste, and of course, as the war in Ukraine has brought into top of mind again, energy security. Uh,
Hmm.
there's an emerging consensus on kind of the elements that need to be achieved to get there. There are certainly policy perspectives such as the price on carbon and ideas such as responsible investment. But the broad two pathways are to ramp up clean electricity, and the second is to go to a clean fuel substitution, perhaps based on hydrogen. So there is a consensus emerging, but wow, is it tough, and there's big infrastructure investments required.
Huge.
So if we come back into this theme around nuclear being on the cusp of a new technological generation, the chart here is a bit dated, but in our industry, we tend to talk about these generations of nuclear reactors. We're currently seeing, if you look around the reactors that are to be coming into service today, they're what are called Gen 3 plus. All the reactors for Gen 1 and Gen 2 relied on what's called active safety. In other words, they needed um, pumps and whatnot to actually, with auxiliary power from off-site to be able to control the reactor. The key difference, and I can't state this enough, from Gen 3 on is that Eureka, where these reactors are now in what are called inherently safe or passively safe. You shut off the system, you shut off all electricity to the site, the reactor goes to zero power. Enormously important. Yes, we're seeing the possibility of what are called Generation 4 reactors coming online. These move away from water as both a moderator and heat transport system into other technologies, and we can talk about that in a moment. But if we come back to where are we going with this, what does the International Panel on Climate Change, what does the International Energy Agency say about nuclear? The first thing is keep those current fleets going as long as you can. Get on with the new builds that are currently planned. The big reactor builds, I say they're all Generation 3, Generation 3 plus, and this transition to this new nuclear energy brand. It's about getting the costs and time of construction down, simpler designs. It's about being compatible with wind and solar, looking beyond electricity and getting waste streams down. That's really where we're focused in Canada. The two sides about keep the fleet going. Morgan's talked about refurbishing Bruce, Darlington, Port Lapro, and we are shutting down Pickering. It just does not make economic sense to refurbish those reactors. And a big focus on the small part of new nuclear. I would also highlight, and I just take a pause, that new nuclear is also about large reactors. It's also about those Gen 3 reactors, but it's not just about electricity, and it's not just about base load. It's about adding in energy storage and load following so it can work with variable renewables. In Canada, we have a roadmap. Rob would know this well. We have an action plan, and we are going forward with demonstrations. And Morgan's already highlighted, those are mixes of Gen 3 and Gen 4 designs. And then what is this about? It's three things coming together, a convergence of three game-changing advances in this technology. One I've already spoken about, and that is the guts of the reactor itself moving into these Generation 3 and 4 designs. These give a capability to operate reactors from a megawatt up to 1.5 gigawatts, and to do so with temperatures that run from 300 degrees Celsius up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Not one design, these are different designs, but enormously broad. About small modular reactors, this is about the way you construct them. It's the way you factory produce them. It's about standardization, harmonization of regulation, get the cost down, get the speed of manufacturing down. That's not all of it, however. It's also about what the reactor is connected to. It's the balance of plant. It's about going to cogen, using the heat and the electricity, going to dispatchability or load following. It's about compatibility with renewables. All that coming together is a new paradigm. That leads, in the particular case of SMRs, to a new value proposition, what I like to call the energy systems multi-tool. On the left-hand side, off screen, you have a reactor. An SMR, this one happens to be a Canadian design by a company called Terrestrial. It's a molten salt design. It produces molten salt running at about 600 degrees. There are numerous designs. But really, in my view, the magic occurs in what these designs are connected to, some mix of these balance of plants features that allows it to directly create electrons for power generation, to couple to thermal storage, actually using concentrated solar technology that gives you the ability to turn those that heat into electricity when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, and finally to use the heat directly for chemical synthesis, such as hydrogen production, or into elements such as desalination. The magic then occurs because you have these markets that run from grid power, including the opportunity to help renewables, to heavy industry, and finally to remote communities. Now, the bands I've got here are notional. There's certainly, like the oil sands, as Axel would know, has a higher demand than what I would indicate here, and it needs a very high temperature reactor as well. The bottom line here is that you see with all of that, you have the opportunity to provide contributions to clean electrification, to clean fuel substitution, to energy storage, and you do it with high-paying jobs. And you also help energy security in northern communities, a just transition. However, there are considerations that need to be taken into account. This is not just large nuclear in a smaller footprint. In particular, let's look at the economic model when it comes to construction. The large reactors are based on the concept of economies of scale. Get the reactor as big as it possibly can be, because all of the infrastructure around it, it doesn't escalate in cost as quickly as the reactor benefit does. So you get a lower cost of construction per unit energy the larger the reactor is. And you see what the large reactors that are being built today are between 1 and 1.5 gigawatt electric. The concept of SMRs turns this concept on its head. And it says we want to get to low construction cost per unit energy produced through a combination of the four factors I see on the left here. You see on the left. It's about modularization and factory build. Plus, it's about design simplification. Plus, it's about standardization. Plus, it's about harmonization of the regulatory frameworks. So what do you get with this? You get global fleets. Think about the airline industry. It's a great equivalence here, and therefore you're able to get those costs down. And oh, by the way, a simpler design, factory production, you get the construction times down. That's the concept. The second, however, is you have to look at this through a systems perspective. And yes, we often come back and talk about the SMR and its balance of plant. But the whole concept of its economic model means you need to have fleets of these. And they have a factory where you're building them, you're fueling them, or refueling them, or refurbishing them, or decommissioning them. And on the left, you have a connection to a fuel supply with mining, with fuel manufacturing, and depending on the fuel cycle, potentially reprocessing. And you have an ultimate disposal of that waste in a deep geological repository. And the blue arrows indicate all of the pathways where nuclear materials are being transported. So what is among the challenges here? Well, just think about the footprint for that SMR system and the implicated jurisdictions: international, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, First Nations. My head hurts. And you think every one of those points is an engagement requirement, not an opportunity, a requirement. There's our indigenous communities as rights holders. There's hosted and impacted communities. There's owners, there's operators, there's license agreements, and there's regulatory licenses. This perspective is enormously important. It can be done, but one has to think about that system concept from the birth of the idea. To wrap this piece up here, I want to come back to a comment I made earlier, and that is if you want nuclear to be a big player in the global energy system transition, which is certainly my thesis here, we're talking about many. And if you want to get to many, the business models that worked for the first big nuclear build out of the 70s through the 90s probably won't work. And we have to come back and fundamentally rethink the business models, operating models, and our social license to do so. We're into and briefly, markets. This is no longer just about large baseload for large grids as the key theme of mine. However, these markets are emerging or nascent. It's about fleets. It's about economies of multiples. It's about borders. No longer can we afford the jurisdictional infighting and everybody approving their own designs and doing their own thing. We need something like the Auto Pact for North America when it comes to nuclear in North America. It's about the externalities. I'm going to come back about this in a moment. There are many externalities, waste being one, that for many energy sources are not internalized, they are for nuclear. It's about a level playing field. It's about investment, responsible investment. A key element for nuclear is one-for-one replacement with coal and gas plants as they come to the end of their operational life. Same footprint, same energy output. And it's about the whole workforce requirement. Importantly, it's also about engagement, something that our industry has not done well and was largely not a requirement during the first big build of the 70s to 90s. But it is a reality today. We have a nuclear hesitant public. It's about host communities, indigenous rights holders, investors, energy decision makers, on and on and on. Which brings me to my last point, and I'll just briefly speak to this because it's, in my mind, enormously important, and that is the public hesitancy to nuclear energy. And you look at in today's context about where one gets one's information, how one discusses these topics, what is truth, who do you trust? It is an enormously difficult space. Rob, I don't envy you in your political life. It is a contact sport and it is a challenge. When it comes to nuclear, we have a whole lot of misunderstanding of our industry out there. I'm going to give you 2 slides here with what I call the 10 myths of nuclear energy. I just took this off the web. This is from one of the big US national labs, the Argonne National Lab in Chicago. And here's its 10 points. Every one of these statements, I expect at one point or other you've heard, such as nuclear energy is bad for the environment, or most Americans don't support nuclear energy, and American Chernobyl will kill thousands of people. And it goes at length to explain why these are myths. A second is from the World Nuclear Association that tackles directly the issue around waste. You see the first bullet, nuclear industry has no solution for the waste problem. That's actually the anti-nuclear message, and they have succeeded enormously effectively in getting that message out as truth. There's another argument, and you run down the list here. We could have a debate around this. The point here is that we have a lot of sources of information that says nuclear is a problem. Nuclear has its problems. It's good to be able to focus on what those actually are. I want to then give you Bob's list of 10 facts about nuclear. It's already been hinted at. You look at about the GHG, life cycle GHG emissions per unit energy produced. Nuclear is better than wind and solar. Over 50 years of nuclear power, by not having to burn fossil fuels, nuclear has actually avoided premature deaths of millions of people around the world. It has saved lives. Its capital costs are high, yes, but when you combine that with its operating costs, its low fuel costs, its long plant lifetimes, it's among the lowest cost electricity generating technologies today, even with the cost of new renewables going lower and lower. In terms of death incurred through the generating technology's life cycle, yes, we've got Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. You include all of that, it's got the best safety record of all generating technologies, including wind and solar. And let me get real controversial here. It is the only generating technology today that's internalized the cost of managing its waste. When Bruce Power is paid for the electricity generated at its generating station, included in that cost is the cost to dispose of its waste. And here is another very controversial point, but its volume of toxic waste is the lowest of all generating technologies, including wind and solar, by orders of magnitude. It has got the least use of natural resources by orders of magnitude. It has the smallest land use by orders of magnitude. Yes, there is some ionizing radiation that comes from these plants, but it is extremely small. In fact, the average radiation dose to the public from nuclear power is about equivalent of eating one banana per year. Having said that, the reality is the public doesn't trust nuclear energy. And I would argue that part of that, it comes back to the reality of how we're regulated. I've got 2 slides left here. If you go back to something we're all very familiar with today, COVID and approval of vaccines, and the role of the regulator on behalf of the public good to do 2 things: determine whether the vaccine is safe and whether the vaccine is effective. It's a balance between risk and benefit to the public good. Yes, there's always the fine print and what it says is safe and what is effective, something we've had enormous dialogue around the world on. But people understand the role of the regulator and by and large respect that. What happens in the case of nuclear? A very regulated industry. What does the regulator do? Determines whether proponent's nuclear energy project is safe. Doesn't speak at all to the benefit. In fact, speaking to the benefit is the responsibility of the proponent. So you got industry having to go to the public and say, I've got a great project, I'm safe, and you want it. And the reality is then you come into those that are opposed and for, it's a tilted playing field. And I would say that when you bring into the benefit that contributes to net zero, you have the potential to change the equation in a substantial way. One thing that I've learned through my work with the think tank at University of Ottawa, which is largely social scientists, is that we're an industry that hasn't paid enough attention to what social scientists are saying. And that we see around the world today a general erosion in the public's trust of experts. This tendency to see debate in the Western democracies increasingly politicized, polarized, and with partisanship. The public wants to be involved in decisions that are directing them, that are impacting them directly. We see the echo chambers of social media, the tendency of everybody, myself included, for what is called motivated reasoning. We'll look at new evidence and accept it or reject it based on our pre-existing worldviews. And you talk about rationality in decision making. Something a social scientist has said to me is that, well, you say nuclear energy is safe, yet you're going to bury your waste a kilometer underground. Surely the public is saying this must be the most dangerous stuff there is. All this comes back to my final point, is that there's a compelling need for new approaches to what the Supreme Court of Canada calls meaningful consultation. The problem is not a knowledge deficiency, it is a trust challenge. And with that, Rob, I'll pass back to you.
Bob, thanks very much. You have touched upon the need to make sure that, in particular, small modular reactors, but more generally, the sector is cognizant of new rules of public engagement, social license or social contract, making sure that it's also situated within a broader conversation about the diversification of Canada's energy portfolio, and in fact, the global energy portfolio, one that's getting increased attention. And certainly the political scientist in me was smiling as really we're talking about the significance of federalism among other institutions that define Canada, as it will affect and impact these conversations. And so I guess I would go to a conversation that Dr. Henry Kissinger was asked in a question. And the question was pretty simple. From the time you started advising governments to today, what's changed? He said, when I started, I used to be asked how government should think about problems. And today I'm asked what they should say about problems. And Bob, you've helped us think very carefully and very clearly through some of the challenges, also some of the opportunities that are associated with SMRs. And